Good evening. I am Nicole Boucher, the W.S. Lewis Librarian and Executive Director of the Lewis Walpole Library, and it is my distinct pleasure and privilege to welcome you to the 27th Lewis Walpole Library Lecture, Professor of Insects and Worms, The Life-Made World of Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, and to welcome this evening's speaker, Professor Jessica Riskin from Stanford University, about whom you will hear more in a moment. But first, a few words for those in the audience who may be less familiar with the Lewis Walpole Library, a branch of the Yale Library system that owes its existence to the vision and generosity of Wilmarth and Annie Burr Lewis. Wilmarth Lewis was Yale class of 1918. Based on our 14-acre campus in the historic heart of Farmington, Connecticut, the library encompasses an extraordinary collection built around Lewis's fascination with the 18th century, and in particular, the life and legacy of Horace Walpole, the renowned British epistolarian, writer, collector, art historian, antiquarian, and Whig politician. Since Lewis established himself in Farmington just over a century ago, the library has grown into an internationally recognized research collection in the field of 18th century studies, attracting researchers from around the world who are drawn to the strength of the library's collections, but also to the tranquil surroundings of our Farmington campus, which provides a distinctive environment for focused inquiry and community with others engaged in the study of some aspect of the 18th century. As one of our Yale graduate student fellows remarked, "I love this place. We all speak the same language. We speak the 18th century." Over time, the library's contributions to the academic life of the university and to the cultural life of the region have expanded to include a diverse range of academic programs and public events, of which this lecture series is one, hosted in Farmington and New Haven, as well as at locations elsewhere in the United States and abroad. Now, before I hand the podium over to Mark Peterson, the Edmund S. Morgan Professor of History, to introduce tonight's speaker, please take a moment to note the emergency exits at the back and the front of this auditorium, and silence your phones, pagers, and other electronic devices. And please note, too, that this evening's lecture is being recorded. Mark.
All right, thank you, Nicole, very much for getting us started, and I just silenced my own phone, so I think we're in good shape here. Hi, my name's Mark Peterson, and I have the good fortune to be the faculty director of the Lewis Walpole Library starting this year, and so this is my first opportunity to be in this position. And as such, it is an honor and a pleasure to introduce this year's Walpole lecturer. Jessica Riskin is the Francis and Charles Field Professor of History at Stanford University, and her academic training took place in institutions near and dear to my own heart, the History and Science undergraduate concentration at Harvard University, and the PhD program in history at the University of California, Berkeley. Before moving to Stanford, she taught at Iowa State University and at MIT. Now, Professor Riskin's scholarly work has had a transformative influence on the way we understand the scientific world of the European Enlightenment, and in particular, the life sciences. She has written many scholarly books and articles, edited important anthologies of the work of other scholars, and also writes for the popular press in venues such as the New York Review of Books and the Los Angeles Review of Books. And at the moment, she's working on another of these collaborations with a former Walpole Library lecturer, her colleague Caroline Winterer at Stanford, on The Apes and Us, a study of the past century's portrayals of primates and their relationship to human beings. Now, I want to take a minute to talk about the arc of her scholarly career. Her first book, Science in the Age of Sensibility, from 2002, explored what the subtitle calls the sentimental empiricists of the French Enlightenment, though it did reach beyond France to include the influence of the likes of John Locke and Bishop Berkeley, Joseph Priestley, and Benjamin Franklin. And it investigates an underappreciated aspect of the emergence of scientific empiricism, that is, the belief that the impact of the natural world upon the human senses, observation, should be the foundation of scientific inquiry. But human beings, of course, are not observing machines. Our sensations of the natural world also generate emotional responses and shape our moral sentiments alongside our rational judgments. And so by ranging widely across different fields of inquiry, from the study of vision and blindness to the reception of Benjamin Franklin's electrical experiments, and by showing how these ideas spilled over into fields such as political economy and law, Riskin demonstrated in this first book how sensibility infused the development of modern structures of knowledge. Now, her next book, called The Restless Clock, A History of the Centuries-Long Argument Over What Makes Living Things Tick, from 2016, narrows the focus, but widens the range of implications. That is, it examines the development of mechanistic views of the life sciences, the idea, borrowed from the physical sciences, that natural phenomena are passive, lacking in agency, mechanisms created by an intelligent designer. But the book turns to explore a series of dissenters from this concept across several centuries, including Descartes, Leibniz, Lamarck, and Darwin, who argued for agency as essential to nature, with a desire to see living things as active, self-making machines. And the argument between these two approaches continues to shape contemporary scientific endeavors. And so when I think of the arc of Professor Riskin's work and turning toward the project you'll be talking about today, it puts me in mind of an expert cinematographer. For instance, someone like Claude Renoir, who collaborated with his brother, the director Jean Renoir, in producing some of the most beautiful films in the history of French cinema. Renoir's deft and fluid camera could pan across a crowd, revealing the shape and character of a large and complex scene, and then zoom in on an individual to capture a moment of intense interiority. And then, with a simple tilt of the camera and a shift in focus, pick out an overlooked but telling detail from the distant background, bring its influence to light, and reestablish the context in a wholly new way. And so in her current project, Professor Riskin extends this approach by zooming in on one enigmatic figure, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, and his pioneering work as an inventor of the field of biology and an innovative thinker in conceptualizing the transformation of species over time, what we would call evolution. A single life, but with the widest implications for understanding how we can know and engage the natural world that we live in. So please join me in welcoming this year's Lewis Walpole Library lecturer, Professor Jessica Riskin. Oh, and as she comes to the stage, let me just, as a matter of housekeeping, say after the lecture, there will be a Q&A session. I'll try to organize this, and there'll be mics passed around the audience so you can ask your questions. So stay tuned. It's going to be a fun show. Thank you.
Well, thank you so very much. Thank you, Mark, for this loveliest of all possible invitations, and followed by loveliest of all possible introductions. And I want to also thank Nicole and Michelle Privé and Sue Walker for wonderful arrangements, for very, very beautiful poster. I've been really having a tremendous time on this visit, and it's a great honor to be the 27th Lewis Walpole Library lecturer. So this on the slide is my protagonist, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, the professor of insects and worms in question. He was, as you've begun to hear, he was a Romantic and Revolution era French naturalist who coined the term biology around 1802. Oh, let me get out my, let's see, I have to be able to switch slides. Here he is coining the term biology. So on the left side is the kind of first handwritten version of it, and on the right side is the first printed version of that word, to designate a science of all and only living things that he thought should exist. And he developed the first theory of evolution, although he didn't use that word. So I'll call it transformation of living forms, or transformism is how people thought about it. And so I am currently working on an intellectual biography of Lamarck that follows his theory of life, sort of, first of all, follows his life and career, and then continues afterwards following his theory of life through the rest of the 19th and 20th centuries and up to the present, which is a hazardous business for a historian, but I'm trying that. Now, you may have heard of him as the person who was all wrong about giraffes and everything else. And I'll come back to the giraffes in a moment. But first, I just want to say a few words about why I think he's interesting and important and worth writing a book about. So as I've been suggesting already, his ideas were foundational to modern biology, and yet his approach to living things was radically different from the dominant tradition in evolutionary biology that took hold around the end of the 19th century and is, to a large degree, I think, still with us. So in fact, Lamarck's theory languished mostly in exile or on the fringes of mainstream biology for over a century, between roughly the 1880s and maybe 1990s, when some of his ideas began to re-enter the mainstream in areas like epigenetic inheritance, niche construction, behavioral factors in evolution, different areas of evolutionary biology. But Lamarck's theory differed radically from the main tradition of later evolutionary biology in a couple of ways. First of all, in terms of the agency that he ascribed to living organisms. He described these as continually creating and transforming themselves and the world around them, presenting a kind of proto-ecological vision of a world made by living organisms, which were, according to Lamarck, the only creative forces in the world. And to live was to create, to compose, to bring elements together into compound matter. The dominant tradition in evolutionary biology, in contrast with that, has rendered living organisms as fundamentally passive, subject purely to random genetic variation and then natural selection acting upon them. So that's the first way in which his theory is different. The second, in keeping with his view of living things as actively making and remaking themselves and the world, his mode of scientific explanation suited that. It was narrative and holistic. He was interested in the desires and actions and experiences of living things, and he rejected the model of scientific explanation that many of his contemporaries were establishing as the reductive account of a fundamentally passive artifact world, sort of engineering model of science. And so I think that his ideas can give us a perspective not only on the development of biology and evolutionary theory and theories of living things, but also on sort of science itself, what it is, what it isn't, how it came to be that way, and what it might otherwise be like. So coming to the giraffe, finally. When I studied biology in high school and college, my teachers and my textbooks, generally, when Lamarck would come up at all, they would take his observations about the giraffe to epitomize kind of his whole theory and how very mistaken it was. So here's what Lamarck had to say about the giraffe. It's on the left side of the slide, and I'll read a translation of it. This is from his magnum opus, his zoological philosophy of 1809. He says, "Concerning habits, it's curious to observe their results in the particular shape and size of the giraffe. We know that this animal, the largest of mammals, a very large mammal, let's just say, inhabits the interior of Africa, that it lives in an area where the terrain, being almost always arid and devoid of grasses, obliges it to graze the leaves of the trees and to struggle constantly to reach these. The result of this habit, maintained over a long time in all individuals of the race, is that the front legs have become longer than the hind legs, and the neck has elongated itself such that the giraffe, without standing up on its hind legs, lifts its head and attains a height of 6 meters, or almost 20 feet. So actually the key word in that passage is not giraffe, but habits. Lamarck's idea was that animals sufficiently complex to be able to form habits could, by doing so, transform their physical structure in just very tiny incremental ways, but heritable ways. And so that if you add those over many generations, you would arrive at dramatic structures like the giraffe's neck. That claim provoked what surely must be one of the longest-lived controversies in the history of science. Over 200 years after Lamarck published the Philosophie zoologique, the idea that living organisms might transform themselves by their own agency in heritable ways remains a hot-button issue in evolutionary biology. So why would that be? I think the short answer is that it violates a core principle of modern science established by the end of the 17th century, which precludes in principle, although often not in practice, but precludes in principle any ascription of agency to natural objects, including living beings. And so Lamarck's ideas about habits violated this injunction on agency in natural objects. And so I actually did come, as Mark, I guess, explained, I came to Lamarck through a book that I wrote a few years ago in which I examined the origins of this passive mechanist model of nature, and in particular of living things. And so, again, as Mark explained, that book is about a struggle between two approaches to a science of life. One that represented living things as passive mechanisms, having received their structure and mode of functioning from an external source, in the first instance, a divine designer. And so that's one model, kind of passive mechanisms. And then the competing model, which emerged in the mid to late 18th century, especially in France, represented living beings as active, self-making, self-transforming things. And so I examined the politics of this struggle, in which the active mechanism approach represented a radical threat to the traditional theological understanding of natural history, because it seemed to usurp God's monopoly on creation and reassign it to living beings. So Lamarck's theory was the crowning achievement of this alternative, centrally French materialist tradition. Instead of appealing to an external source of agency, as in the theological argument from design and the classical mechanist physiology that went along with it, Lamarck said, first of all, that all living organisms originated in spontaneous generation, or the simplest living organisms, which give rise to all subsequent ones, originated in spontaneous generation, which was triggered by forces like electricity and heat, acting upon inanimate matter. And then once spontaneously generated, living matter had an intrinsic tendency to complexify. He called this the pouvoir de la vie, the power of life, a kind of intrinsic complexifying tendency. And he compared this to the tendencies of inanimate matter, which people were, contemporary physicists were interested in. Electricity follows conductors, and magnetic attraction and repulsion, gravitational force. There are all kinds of tendencies in inanimate matter. And so his idea was, why wouldn't there be a characteristic tendency in animate matter? That's the pouvoir de la vie, this complexifying tendency. As organisms become more complex, on the right side of the slide, you see the first version of his chart of this. Animals they're becoming more complex actually from top to bottom. So the simplest animals are at the top, and then the more complex ones are at the bottom in this chart. As they become more complex, another cause of transformation begins to act as well, namely responsiveness, an ability to respond to the environment. In lower organisms, this responsiveness took various kind of primitive and rudimentary forms, but from the level of birds and mammals, he says. So birds and mammals, at that point, the responsiveness can take the form of acts of will through which animals can form habits, develop ways of life in response to their circumstances. And so not only did he place evolutionary agency within the evolving organism, but he described this process of transformation over time as a transfer of agency from outside to inside the organism. He says, as nature transports into the interior of animals the forces of transformation, putting these increasingly at their disposal. And he said that this must be the case because if each creature owed its organization purely to an external source, then animals, he says, would be totally passive machines, lacking sensibility, lacking what he called the inner feeling of existence, with no power to act, with no ideas, or there would be no such thing as thought or intelligence. There wouldn't really be life if animals were purely passive machines. And in fact, he went a step further yet, and he said that not only did living organisms create and transform themselves, but he claimed that they created and composed the inanimate world also around them. And in this process, he gave the pivotal role to plants, which made sense for somebody who actually began his career as a botanist. Although actually I should start, so I'll back up even a farther step. It's not quite right that he began his career as a botanist. So now I'll sort of back up and tell you the story of Lamarck's life. He actually started off studying for the priesthood. He came from a family of the kind of impoverished family of the military nobility. He was the 11th child. And his family had drained their funds on launching the military careers of his older brothers. And so when he was 11, he got packed off to the Jesuit seminary in Amiens to study for the priesthood. And he hated it. And when his father died, his first words, according to his son Auguste, his first words upon finding out that his father had died was, "So I won't be a priest," and he flung off the hated seminarian's collar and left without ever looking back. What he really wanted at that point was to be a soldier like his brothers, and he managed to finagle a letter of introduction from a local countess, very obliging local countess, whose brother was a high-placed general. And with this letter, Lamarck, age 17, took one of his mother's old horses and galloped off to join a regiment fighting in Westphalia. This was in the midst of the 7 Years' War. And he arrived on the eve of the Battle of Wellinghausen, which, okay, so you have, I didn't have an image of the Battle of Wellinghausen, but you have a different battle of the 7 Years' War. And the French were utterly routed in this battle. But he managed to get himself taken into a regiment as a sub-lieutenant by the simple expedient of just marching off into battle with a company of grenadiers and then seizing command when both the captain and the lieutenant were killed. And that's how he came to botany. So how's that for a plot twist? He was afterwards garrisoned with his regiment in Provence, and he was enchanted by the flowers that blanket the Provençal landscape in a rainbow of colors. And so during a leave at home in Picardy, he traded some of his music notebooks. He played the viola da gamba, sort of like a cello. Well, I don't need to tell an 18th century crowd. And he really loved music, but he also loved, as he discovered, flowers, and so he traded some of his precious music notebooks to his brother in exchange for Chaumel's Summary of the History of Common Plants, which is on the right side of the slide. And he brought that back with him after the leave and took it with him on rambles and started collecting specimens and getting a local pharmacist to help him identify them. At age 24, he left the military. Now, according to Georges Cuvier, the paleontologist and comparative anatomist, and Lamarck's arch nemesis, and also the person who was responsible for writing the first official biographical essay because of his position at the French National Institute. He wrote the first draft of a biography of Lamarck in the form of a remarkably hostile eulogy, which I'll talk more about in a moment. But According to Cuvier, Lamarck had to leave the military after one of his companions playfully attempted to lift him by the head, causing a serious derangement in the glands of the neck, according to Cuvier. His son, I think that it's just a funny story because if Lamarck's life were a novel, this neck stretching episode would be kind of a foreshadowing of the later giraffe, the fact that he can never live down this giraffe thing. And it's possible that Cuvier used some poetic license because, according to Auguste, again, Lamarck's son, the neck problem was actually scrofula and illness. Anyway, Lamarck had to abandon the army and he went to Paris in search of medical treatment. And once he was in Paris, the treatment was successful, apparently. He set about becoming a botanist in earnest. He started taking courses at the Jardin du Roi, the Royal Botanical Garden. And one day, on a botanizing jaunt with his brother, he encountered none other than Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who was also out collecting botanical specimens. Rousseau was then about 60, living in Paris in the thick of his botanical phase. He often went on field trips on the outskirts of the city, and he condescended to apparently to let Lamarck go along with him on these botanical expeditions. Rousseau, who was famously neurotic and difficult, apparently said it was okay as long as Lamarck promised never to speak to him. He had to botanize in silence. Further inspired by this encounter with Jean-Jacques, Lamarck produced his first published work, which was a 3-volume opus on French flora, in which he adopted some elements of the Swedish botanist Carl Linnaeus' scheme of nomenclature. And he also endorsed Linnaeus' somewhat scandalous idea that plants had sex, that flowers were in fact sex organs, the stamens comparable to testes and the pistils to ovaries. Linnaeus was not the first to say this, although he was probably the most influential. It was almost a century since the English doctor Nehemiah Grew had proposed the idea, but it remained somewhat controversial, especially in France. Lamarck boldly said, yes, that plants had sex. Not only that, it distinguished them from minerals as organic beings, and he has these kind of rhapsodic passages in French flora about the sweet perfumes and laughing and lively demeanor of the flowers, and he says that to the self-centered human naturalist, human observer, all of this seems to exist only for him. But in fact, flowers are not meant to beguile humans, they're meant to beguile other plants. And so Lamarck's French flora caught the notice of Georges Buffon, who was then director, on the right side of the slide, he was then director of the Jardin du Roi, the Royal Botanical Garden in Paris, and he made Lamarck his protege. Now, around this time, Lamarck began developing his truly radical idea that living things actually created the inanimate world, composing it from elements. And he wrote that all minerals, by which he meant all inanimate compound matter, arose from the actions of living beings, and that plants played the primary role in this process because they could produce themselves just out of sunlight, air, and water. And he sort of, describes this extraordinary capacity of plants to do this. So he talks about how a hyacinth or a narcissus bulb that is suspended in a carafe of distilled water can grow an entire flowering plant just with sunlight, air, and water. When you weigh the plant, if you weigh the original bulb and then you weigh the plant, you'll discover indeed that the plant has created all this matter. It's much heavier. Just by merging elements together. And he describes a similar, I mentioned this actually yesterday, he describes a similar experiment using a turnip. He says you carve a hollow in the side of the turnip, you suspend it by its root in the air, and you just pour water into this hollow in the turnip. And so I think of it as being sort of like Harry Houdini. It can't possibly cheat. It's hanging there, suspended by its root. It has nothing but sunlight, air, and water. There's nothing else it could possibly have. And yet it creates a whole flowering, a whole plant from that. So, and finally, he talks about the reason why you have these pea plant on the other side of the slide is that he says he knows people who in the midst of the dark Parisian winter, like to grow pea plants, raise peas in an earthenware dish in their apartment using only pure water and cotton wool to support the roots. At this point, he himself lived in a small apartment near the botanical garden with his wife Rosalie, and at that point, 2 young children. And so I like to imagine them in the dark gray Parisian winter, watching these decorative pea plants kind of magically unfurl, conjure themselves from thin air in earthenware dishes. So this ability to merge elements into compounds was unique to plants. According to Lamarck, no animal could subsist on pure water, earth, fire, and air. And so plants originated the cosmic relay chain, bringing together the primitive elements and handing the combinations off to animals. By eating and digesting, animals could then turn plants or other animals into more elaborate compounds, and therefore they shared with plants the defining ability of all living beings, which was to build, compose, create. Botany was the most fundamental science since it studied plants, the original source of all composed things on Earth, whether living or inanimate. Luckily for the history of biology, Lamarck was not allowed to remain a botanist, but had to remake himself at the age of 50 into a zoologist during the Revolution with the reorganization of the Jardin du Roi. They got rid of the Roi, and it transformed the garden into the Republican Jardin des Plantes, Garden of Plants. And the Revolutionary Committee in charge of this reorganization assigned Lamarck the kind of lowliest of 3 positions in zoology in the garden, the professorship of insects and worms. So there were other people in line for the botanical positions, which was what he had wanted, and the kind of more charismatic fauna among the zoological positions. So he ended up being professor of insects and worms. He did have actually an extraordinary shell collection, probably from making deals with fishmongers in Paris. He had collected quite a beautiful and large collection of shells, and shellfish counted as worms. So in some sense, there was an argument for appointing him to this position, but it was a somewhat tangential one. So he was now a middle-aged widower with now 6 children. Ultimately, he would have 8 children. He had little choice but to remake himself from a botanist to a zoologist to take up this position. As professor in the botanical garden, he was entitled to lodgings there. So he was able to move with his family into an apartment on the 2nd floor of this 15th century mansion that Buffon had acquired to serve as the intendant's residence. I actually visited last summer. I went with a colleague and we sort of lurked outside because it's not really open for visits, but we lurked outside until somebody came out, and then we asked her if she would show us around. So we went in and looked around on the 2nd floor. It's all a warren of offices now, but it still was very cool to walk up this kind of big curving staircase to the 2nd floor and then look out through the windows onto the garden. So Lamarck started teaching in the garden, and he told his students later that he had initially feared that there would be a lot less interest in studying insects and worms than, if he had to be a zoologist, why couldn't he at least have gotten to study great magnificent creatures like lions and tigers? But then he realized a couple of things. First of all, true, the insects and the worms were, at first glance, it seemed to be the larvae that eat holes in clothing and furniture, and the slugs that ruin your garden, and sort of just pests. Then it occurred to him that, in fact, his purview included 9/10 of the known animal kingdom. And so that made it important in itself. And then he reasoned that these simplest animals must have come first in the order of nature's production. So he's already thinking in terms of an order of nature's production, right? And he thinks that in the simpler animals, perhaps we can witness the essence and foundation of animal life. So contemplating his insects and his worms with this gleam of hope, he first of all divined a new organizing principle, and he renamed his creatures invertebrates. So inventing a new taxonomic category. And the invertebrates, Lamarck said, conduct us insensibly toward the inconceivable limit of animalization, toward those beings barely endowed with animality, with whom nature perhaps began. And this limit or minimum or essence of animality, he said, was none other than the unbridled power of generation. So these simplest creatures, they have fewer animal faculties than more complex ones, but the faculties that they do have are much broader in extent than in more complex animals, starting especially with the power of generation. The very simplest animals, such as the polyps, freshwater hydra or polyp that Tremblay had studied. The life of each of their parts is independent of all the other parts, meaning that you can chop them up in pieces and generate a whole polyp from any one of those pieces. Quite an extraordinary feature of these animals that the Genevan naturalist Tremblay had famously shown with his experiments on these polyps or freshwater hydra. And other invertebrates also have extraordinary powers of generation and regeneration, and so Lamarck goes through them: the metamorphosis of insects, the regeneration of the heads of snails. The ability to grow a new head is fairly extraordinary. Crustaceans can grow new legs. Starfish can grow new rays. The ability of coral polyps to multiply by a perpetual budding, forming plant-like stems. And Lamarck wrote that because these animals have such extraordinary powers of generation and regeneration, the invertebrates far outnumber the vertebrates. And he said we'd likely never know their full extent because of the infinite smallness of the smallest among them. These tiniest and simplest of animals displayed, he said, a frightening fecundity, such that it seems, so to speak, as if matter animalizes itself from every direction. But what must be our astonishment, he goes on, I'm still quoting Lamarck, upon learning that the tiniest and simplest of creatures, the madrepora and millipora coral polyps, with just a little help from shellfish, have been the chief producers of the great calcareous mountain chains and enormous banks of chalk found all over the earth. These minuscule animals create islands, fill up bays and gulfs, clog ports, and completely transform the coastlines. So the invertebrates became the basis of Lamarck's theory, not just that living organisms continually refashion themselves in the world around them, but even more radically that they held a monopoly on creative agency. He wrote, "For my part, without rejecting anything connected with religious belief, nor that it can be a consolation for the good man who persuades himself of it, I will say that this kind of consideration is absolutely foreign to my subject." So he's sort of avoiding that. Souls, he says, are not physically knowable, whereas the dynamic, creative action of living beings is apparent everywhere, all around, everywhere you look. Life, he says, now is the manifest capacity to create in the face of all nature's forces of destruction. The science of life is the study of this capacity for heroic creation against these, the kind of onslaught of nature. And he writes, "There reigns throughout the universe an astonishing activity, living things doing the work of living, growing, reproducing, eating, digesting, moving, propagating life among themselves, engaging in this constant work of construction and combination, merging elements into compound matter, in valiant defiance of the rest of nature's tendency to destroy all combinations." He was also, just as a sort of aside, he was interested in the collaborative aspect of living beings' work of building and creating the world and fending off destruction, plants handing off to animals, and animals then working together. So there's a struggle in this vision of nature, but unlike in Darwin's theory or in later evolutionary theories, the emphasis is not so much on competition. I would say it's perhaps more on collaboration. So there's this kind of lovely story. One day in the spring of 1798, he had brought his children to a country house that he briefly owned outside of Paris. And at the house, he noticed a swallow's nest in one of the windows. And shortly afterwards, he saw that a local child had destroyed the nest, leaving the pair of swallows homeless, just as at the moment when the female was about to lay her eggs. And immediately, he says, 10 or 12 swallows gathered around the wreckage, and the birds were so agitated and noisy that at first it seemed to him that they were quarreling. It looked like they were fighting. But he soon realized that it was actually just the opposite. They had organized themselves to rebuild the nest together. And so he watched in amazement, he recounts the story, as some of the birds remained by the nest, while others came and went in rapid succession, and carrying twigs and things. And he says, swallows generally take 8 to 12 days to build a nest, but these managed to finish by the following morning. So he offered this story to his friend Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire, who was a colleague in the botanical garden and who was collecting instances of animals collaborating with one another, which I think is quite lovely because it was Lamarck also exemplifying himself the very capacity that Geoffroy was studying. So there's heroism and collaboration, but there's also a distinct note of tragedy in Lamarck's story, since of course each living thing is doomed ultimately to failure. It will lose the astonishing principle that has allowed it to resist the onslaught of nature, continually dragging it towards its ruin. The vanquished being, he says, is now completely at the mercy of nature's destructive power. When living things died, he says, Lamarck explained, they surrendered all they had made in a lifetime, their bodies and secretions and other productions, to the forces of nature, particularly fire, which then acted upon these, putting them through various transformations, producing a succession of minerals. And thus on all sides, he says, one perpetually sees nothing but an alternating succession of life and death, formation and destruction, movement and rest. Now, Lamarck's idea of living beings as tragic heroes striving to create as much of the world as possible before surrendering to their fate may sound like a romantic notion, as indeed it was. Yet 2 centuries later, the role of organisms in the formation of minerals has inspired renewed interest among geologists. So the images on the slide illustrate the so-called Great Oxidation Event, which was a sharp increase in atmospheric oxygen that took place a little over 2 billion years ago when emerging microorganisms seeded the air with oxygen. And apparently, not being a geologist, I've consulted with people who know this. Apparently, this was probably a crucial turning point in the proliferation of diverse minerals on Earth. So, as Robert Hazen, who's the mineral physicist in the slide, whose images I've borrowed, he puts it: the origin of life depends on minerals, but the origin of minerals depends upon life. There's a reciprocal causation. So you can see that Lamarck's theory of living beings was also a theory of the composition of matter. And as such, it angered the authors of a competing theory of the composition of matter. In fact, when Lamarck tried to read a work presenting his theory at the National Institute, he was interrupted and heckled so badly that he had to abandon the reading. And his ideas were especially offensive to 3 influential people who would become favorites of Napoleon. One was the mathematician, astronomer, physicist, and statesman Pierre-Simon Laplace, on the left, whom Napoleon appointed Minister of the Interior and then ennobled as a Count of the Empire. And he was sort of a member of Napoleon's scientific inner circle. Another was the doctor and chemist Antoine-François Fourcroy in the middle. Also, Napoleon appointed him to State Council, made him Director of Public Instruction, and also ennobled as a Count of the Empire. I'll get to the third one in a little bit. But Laplace and Fourcroy had each worked closely with Antoine Lavoisier, a chemist and tax collector and philosophical revisionist who had lost his head to the guillotine in the spring of 1794, along with the other tax collectors. However, his new approach to chemistry remained very much alive. So I'm going to make a little detour to talk about Lavoisier. He and his comrades had set out to do no less than remake the general understanding of the nature of matter. In place of earth, air, fire, and water, they announced a long list of elements with Greek names to which they said all kinds of matter could be reduced. And these elements could exist as solids, liquids, or airs, depending how much caloric or heat they contained. And this claim was accompanied by startling experimental results. For instance, Water, Lavoisier announced, was made of two different kinds of air, one highly flammable and the other excellent for breathing. And these chemical revolutionaries demonstrated the composition of water and other substances in a series of decomposition and recomposition experiments using an extremely precise balance to weigh the ingredients and the products of each reaction. And they assumed that matter was conserved, so the combined weights of the ingredients should equal the weights of the products. And then they identified the lightest products that they could make as the simplest units of composed substances. And they said these are the true elements of matter, not the old Aristotelian earth, air, fire, and water. So on the slide you see some illustrations of a set of experiments to demonstrate the equivalence of respiration and combustion, and to decompose and recompose water. Reduction was Lavoisier's and his collaborators' chief experimental procedure. That is to say, in experiments they reduced various kinds of matter to simpler parts. Reduction was the defining feature of their worldview. They saw the material world as reducible to invisibly tiny inert elements. And reduction, finally, was the central principle of their model of science. To them, explaining something scientifically meant breaking it down to its smallest, meaning lightest, parts. So Lamarck vigorously attacked these chemists, including Laplace and Fourcroy, who had both co-authored articles with Lavoisier. And he attacked them and their reductive approach to science in a series of writings in the mid-1790s, or I should say, refuted the theory, in a series of writings in the mid-1790s, culminating in the memoirs that I mentioned, that when he tried to read them, as was customary at the National Institute, he was heckled and interrupted and he couldn't continue. And generations of historians have sort of shaken their heads in rueful mystification at why Lamarck would have done this. It's sort of gratuitous. Why did he display this gratuitous antipathy for the new chemistry? After all, he was a botanist turned zoologist, not a chemist, and he did himself a lot of damage with this. But it actually wasn't gratuitous. He had a powerful reason connected with the new science of life that he would soon name biology. He was out to defend the creative agency and irreducibility of living things, which the new chemists denied. So, for instance, Fourcroy wrote that nature merely lent certain materials to plants and animals for a brief time and then reclaimed them to go on executing her perpetual cycle of composition and decomposition. And Lamarck retorted that nature didn't compose anything, only living things can compose things. Against the new chemists' mechanical theory of composition by heat and pressure, Lamarck presented an entirely different theory of the composition of matter based on the agency of living things and the principle that they were the unique force of composition. The entire surface of the globe, he wrote with dramatic pathos, the bosom of the waters and the whole atmosphere are the vast field where nature ceaselessly destroys every composed substance which the principle of life does not defend or ceases to maintain. At the same time, against the new chemists' reductive model of scientific explanation, analyzing all things, including plants and animals, into their lightest parts, Lamarck developed a very different kind of explanation. He argued that living organisms and the things that they composed were not susceptible to analysis. They were irreducible. No analysis could break them down into their component parts because Lamarck said they had no pre-existing component parts. Organisms synthesized themselves and the world around them, starting with plants just from sunlight, air, and water. So what Fourcroy took for the constituents of organic matter, Lamarck said were in fact the products of organic action. And therefore, he said, instead of reducing everything to immediate principles, let's say that vegetable and animal matters are the products of organic action, characterized by distinctive, remarkable properties. So posterity has judged Lamarck to have been just wrong in rejecting the new chemistry, and Laplace and Fourcroy to have been right. And in an important sense, of course, that's true. Lavoisier's new chemistry gave rise to a powerful new understanding of matter. But I just want to suggest that in another sense, you could see it from a different angle as not so much a matter of right versus wrong, but of competing ways of seeing things. If we define elements as the lightest parts of matter producible in laboratory experiments, then of course it makes good sense to say that hydrogen and oxygen are the elements that make up water. But if, on the other hand, we define elements of matter as the primitive substances out of which living beings compose themselves and the world around them, it might make sense to say that these elements are sunlight, air, and water. And in fact, according to that way of looking at things, it could even make sense to say that oxygen is not an element but a product of organic action, since its presence in Earth's atmosphere results from the activities of living beings. So there's a certain logic to it. Historically speaking, of course, Laplace's and Fourcroy's way of seeing things triumphed, along with their definition of science. And in the wake of their success, Lamarck's vision of nature and of science and of life became not just wrong, but somehow unthinkable, beyond the pale. Another member of Napoleon's inner circle whom Lamarck antagonized was Georges Cuvier, whom we've already met, the Lutheran naturalist, who was, I've described as Lamarck's arch nemesis, who occupied the chair in comparative anatomy at the Jardin des Plantes, and whom Napoleon also appointed to a succession of ever higher administrative posts. Cuvier categorically rejected the idea that living forms changed over time from generation to generation. He believed in the fixity of species. His central anatomical principle was the principle of correlation of parts, and it was sort of an assertion of rational design. He claimed that you could infer all of the parts of any creature from any one part because they all follow from each other by rational necessity, implicitly because they're the work of a rational divine designer. And he was a very brilliant comparative anatomist who was very good at predicting, based on fossil excavations of a tiny part of a fossil remain. He could say, okay, now you should be able to find the following, and then people would go out and look for those things and very often find them. So to Cuvier, animals' habits and behaviors followed from their structures. They behaved the way they were rationally designed to behave. Lamarck said it was exactly the other way around. Their structures resulted from their habits and behaviors. You see, so they're exactly antithetical views. And Lamarck furthermore said that evidence of animal self-transformation is everywhere. Evidence not of their design, of their having been designed, but of their continually being in the process of transforming themselves. Laying out the evidence in the Philosophie zoologique, Lamarck begins with the cases in which the diminished use of a part or organ resulted in its weakening or even disappearing altogether. So for example, he says that right whales and birds and anteaters can swallow their food without chewing it, so they don't have any need for teeth, but they apparently once did. And his colleague and friend Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire found teeth, he says, concealed within the jaw of a right whale fetus and grooves for teeth in the beaks of certain birds. And so that's one example, he thinks, of a vestigial part that shows the loss of a part that is no longer useful. Another category that he offers concerns eyes. He says moles who live in the dark don't use their eyes very much, so these have become tiny and barely visible. That same is true for a kind of spalax, a kind of mole rat that lives underground, and the olm, an aquatic reptile that inhabits deep underwater caves. They don't need eyes, and so their eyes have shrunk and become barely visible. Then there's the case of legs, or rather their lack. So he says snakes must once have had legs like their closest amphibian relatives, frogs and salamanders, but having adopted the habit of crawling on the ground and hiding in the grass through repeated efforts to pass through narrow spaces, snakes have elongated their bodies such that legs would have been quite useless to these animals. And ears are the clincher to Lamarck. He says, unlike teeth and legs and eyes, ears are common to all vertebrates. And in this contrast, he finds proof of his claim that it was disuse that caused the teeth and legs and eyes of certain vertebrates to shrink or even disappear. He reasons that light doesn't penetrate everywhere in the world. There are inhabited places that are dark, that are absolutely dark. But he says there are no inhabited places that are without sound, which penetrates everywhere and passes through any medium. Therefore, all animals with ears would have had at least some opportunity to exercise them. So some vertebrates have no use for teeth or legs or eyes, and they've gradually lost those parts. But all invertebrates have used their ears, at least to some degree, and so they've all retained them. Basically use it or lose it. Then he has the opposite sort of examples in which the increased use of an organ or part develops and strengthens it. So he wrote, for example, that water birds, as distinct from birds who perch in trees, by means of their efforts to swim, that is to push against the water so as to move about, not only, and this is true not only actually of, he says, of water birds like ducks and geese, but also frogs and sea turtles and otters and beavers, all creatures that swim. By their efforts to push through the water, they have slowly stretched the membranes between their toes and acquired webbed feet. In contrast, birds that clasp branches, by stretching to clasp, they've gotten elongated claws that become lengthened and sharpened and curved into hooks like the talons of eagles. Another of his favorite examples was this shorebird's long legs and neck. He says that shorebirds are birds who dislike swimming, and yet they find themselves obliged to wade into the water to catch their prey. Continually sinking into the mud, the bird stretches its legs in distaste, squeamishness about the water, and this habit has resulted in these long, skinny, featherless legs that make them look like they're on stilts. The same fastidiousness has shaped their long necks, wanting to fish without wetting its body. This kind of bird stretches and cranes its neck, resulting in a remarkable lengthening, he says, in the necks of all shorebirds. And once again, he has proof of this, kind of confirmation anyway, that these extravagant bodily forms have followed from the tastes and inclinations and habits of the animals. When he compares shorebirds with swans and geese have long necks but short legs. And the reason, I wonder if you can think of Lamarck's reason for this, these swimming birds, he says, are perfectly happy in the water. So they have no need to stretch their legs. They're happy to be floating in the water. And so their legs have remained short. But from the habit of plunging their head as deeply as they can, in search of aquatic larvae and plants and other edible things, they've gotten elongated necks. When a seal arrived in the menagerie of the Museum of Natural History at the end of June 1809, Lamarck watched it with great interest. For one thing, its obvious kinship with land mammals confirmed his sense that all mammals, and indeed all animal life, had originated in the water. He also noticed that the seal could join its hind flippers together, separating the digits to spread out the membranes between them, making a large paddle, he said, which it uses for traveling about in the water in the same way as fishes use their tail. When it was on land, though, it could move speedily, he says, by means of an undulatory movement of the body, not using its hind legs at all. These it held stretched out behind, but supporting itself on its forelegs, on the arms up to the wrists, and not really using its hands. The seal seized prey with either its hind feet or its mouth, and when it remained underwater for an extended period, he says, it completely closes its nostrils just as we close our eyes when it was underwater. So the main lesson that Lamarck drew from his observation of the seal was that from the habit of using its hind legs as a fin or a paddle, the legs had shifted in position, he says, so that they extended in the same direction as the axis of the body. However, the legs had not fully joined together and become a fin because the seal still used them for seizing prey. So the seal's distinctive uses of its hind legs had produced this structure that could work either like a paddle or like a hand. And it was the habits, the uses that created that versatile structure. So going back to Cuvier, you can see that Lamarck's was a fundamentally different way of understanding living organisms from Cuvier's. To Cuvier, living beings had no role in shaping themselves and behaved exactly as they were designed to behave. Function followed structure. To Lamarck, on the other hand, living beings were continually transforming themselves from within by their desires and habits and striving efforts, and structure followed behavior. Cuvier did believe in extinctions, so therefore he believed that fossilized remains, often the animals that they represented were different from the animals today on the Earth, living on the Earth. But he took the fossils of extinct creatures not to represent transformation over time, but a series of catastrophes like floods and fires, each eliminating the creatures of a given time and place to be replaced later by brand new equally fixed and unchanging creatures. And that theory implicitly supported the doctrine of special creation, the idea that God created each species for its niche in nature and then replenished the supply of creatures after each catastrophe, like the Great Flood in the Bible, by new acts of creation. This could hardly have been better suited to Napoleon's purpose. Here was a scientific doctrine of revolutionary change that was at the same time, if you think about it, profoundly conservative. Each revolution was imposed from outside rather than rising up from within. Each was a return to the same ultimate authority, and the whole thing was guaranteed now not by the church, but by Napoleon's savants, his inner circle of scientists, by Cuvier. Cuvier's science, in other words, was cutting edge, but at the same time, it bolstered rather than threatening an authoritarian order. First Napoleon's, and then that of the Bourbon Restoration. Charles X would make Cuvier a baron. It was emphatically not the science of the materialist, atheist revolutionaries from whom Napoleon took such pains to distance himself in his ongoing struggle to seize and retain the royalists' ground. But nor was it the older science of the Catholic Church. I think Cuvier, it was sort of an extraordinary feat that he and others accomplished of translating the authority of religion into science, a very powerful modern combination. It's no surprise, therefore, that Napoleon detested Lamarck and his science. So the image on the slide on the left represents a famous story, first told by the astronomer François Arago. It took place when Arago was just 23 years old on a cold day in December of 1809. The members of the French National Institute were waiting for the emperor in a chilly salon of the Tuileries Palace to present him their new publications. And the savants and the men of letters were dressed in green. The military aides were in gold brocade. Standing near the young Arago was Lamarck, now 65 and in fragile health, although he would live another 2 decades. He held in his hands a copy of the Philosophie zoologique, this magnum opus in which he develops his powerful idea of the transformation of living beings incrementally over generations in response to their environments. Arago and Lamarck together sort of were, before Napoleon arrived, were just observing and remarking the eagerness of everyone around them to make sure that they would be noticed by the emperor. Napoleon at last entered the room and approached Arago as he would a new conscript, fixing him with a stare and barking, "You're very young. What's your name?" Before Arago could answer, his neighbor on the left, eager to be noticed, piped up with, "He cultivates astronomy." Napoleon, "What have you done?" And then Arago says, his neighbor on the right, not wanting to be outdone, says, "He has just measured the meridian in Spain." So while Arago was reflecting that Napoleon must take him for a mute or an imbecile, the emperor turned to Lamarck, who presented his Philosophie zoologique, and Lamarck snatched it from his hands, growling, "I'm taking this only out of consideration for your white hair. Give it here." And without looking at the book, he thrust it into the hands of an aide, while Lamarck, with tears of humiliation rolling down his cheeks, tried to explain what was in the book. But actually, I think had Napoleon known what was in the book with its revolutionary understanding of living nature as continually creating and recreating itself from raw matter, he probably would have liked it even less. Lamarck's natural world of inherent active powers, its substance literally generated and shaped by its own living denizens, was uncongenial to authoritarianism. Rather than consolidating power in the hands of a central authority, it distributed power all throughout the living world. So, as I've mentioned, Cuvier was the victor who wrote the history, if history is written by the victors, quite literally, because he, of course, in his position at the French National Institute, wrote Lamarck's official eulogy, which was in fact an anti-eulogy, damningly describing Lamarck's theory as poetry rather than science. And that condemnation set the tone for assessments of Lamarck's ideas for a long time to come. As a postscript, though, I just want to mention the fact that Lamarckian, I think I said this at the beginning as well, Lamarckian ideas have lately been making their way back into mainstream biology, by which I mean, I have to be careful when I say that, because of course Lamarck died in 1829, so you know, it's in kind of general terms. When I say that his ideas have been making their way back into mainstream biology, what I mean is that evolutionary biologists have been taking a new interest in the ways in which animal experiences and behaviors might shape the course of evolutionary development. So for instance, the study of epigenetic inheritance and factors affecting gene expression. Epigenetic inheritance is the study of all the kind of structures outside the genes that affect gene expression, how the genes shape the body. And in that field of research, it's a big and growing field of research, it includes the possibility of the inheritance of characteristics that are acquired in the course of an individual lifetime, those being inherited in the next generation. And so on the slide are two examples of recent proposals that epigenetic inheritance might play a role in the case that came to symbolize Lamarck's theory, that is the giraffe's long neck. One on the left side is from Floyd Reed, a population geneticist at the University of Hawaii, and the other one on the right is by two biologists, Rosalind John at Cardiff University and Claire Hugel at Paris Diderot at the CNRS in France. And I'm now involved in an experiment. This is my first foray into scientific experiments, but Floyd Reed on the left, and my colleague Mark Feldman at Stanford, and Mike Skinner, a biologist at Washington State, and a group of us are involved in doing an experiment, a kind of very preliminary experiment to test the idea of epigenetic factors in inheritance in giraffes. So that's underway now. But moreover, epigenetic inheritance is, of course, by no means the only area in current biology that threatens this kind of dominant paradigm in evolutionary science, insisting on the passivity of the evolving organism. Epigenetic inheritance is not the only area that threatens that. A growing number of biologists have been working to incorporate developmental and ecological and behavioral and even cultural factors into evolutionary theory. There's a scientist here at Yale whom I'm going to be meeting actually tomorrow morning, Martha Munoz, who works with lizards in the Andes that have gone up 3,000 meters from sea level way up into the high mountain. And she has been studying the way in which their behaviors have led the course of natural selection. They figured out ways of warming themselves. It's much colder up there. And they figured out ways of warming themselves in crevices in the rock. And natural selection has selected for things that make those behaviors easier, like shorter legs and flatter heads and things like that. So her idea is that that behavior has led natural selection, and that it's a form of evolutionary agency on the part of these organisms. So I think that with all of this current research, Napoleon would no doubt be annoyed. But that is a story for another day. Thank you. I should stay here, right?
Yes, absolutely, yes.
Okay.
So your microphone, right? So you can...
I can wander. Okay. I can wander.
So 1,000 thanks to you for that inspiring lecture. And we do have time for a few questions, so I will gaze about the room, and there are roving microphones. So please identify yourself, exhibit agency. Right in the middle there. Ellen, the microphone is coming to you from your left.
Oh, that's Ellen.
Yes.
Hi.
Wonderful to see you.
I'm
Wonderful
so happy
talk.
to see you. Yeah.
Biology, the term biology. Can you talk a little bit about how he hit on that word?
Oh, Greek,
Yeah.
the study of life, a science of life. What's interesting about it, though, is that he, I think, there have been many fields devoted to living things, among other things, so natural history, which includes rocks and rivers, then subsets like botany or zoology. But the idea of a science of all living things and only living things was a new idea in this period. Now, to be entirely accurate and fair, I should say that a couple of other people, at least one German writer, came up with the same word around the same time, independently. But I believe that Lamarck was the first one to publish it and to promulgate it and to popularize it. So it was an idea that people were arriving at around the turn of the 18th to the 19th century.
But before that, when people talked about kind of the totality of living things, how did they describe it?
I mean, I think natural history, people talked about an entire natural world that included inanimate and animate elements. And so, in a sense, Lamarck, he's asserting a new distinction. In an Aristotelian continuum, it's all the way from inanimate things, through all the way up, through all forms of life. And so Lamarck was asserting a kind of disjuncture between life and non-life. And it's true. I mean, as you heard when I was speaking, he kind of sees a struggle of all living things against all the rest of nature. That's the kind of strife in his theory. So, right, it does involve a new disjuncture between life and non-life.
Question over here from Michael Printy on the corner there. Another.
Thank you very much. That was very fascinating. You mentioned this is part of a larger sort of intellectual biography of Lamarck. So I'm kind of curious, where was he getting his ideas other than from some of his other, quote unquote biologists or natural historians? What struck me the most when you're in the general introduction is thinking about Immanuel Kant and the notion that the human being creates, it's the mind that creates the world, not the other way around. So there's an active agency, and that's the Kantian revolution, so to speak. So I'm wondering, first of all, is he influenced by that in any way whatsoever, or sort of devolutions of that kind of thinking? And then I was thinking about Kant, and Kant used the term epigenesis in one of his notorious essays on race, is that you have these germs of the different kinds of, skin types, etc. But once they're fixed, they never go back. So that kind of led me thinking, do these behavioral changes, if the animal moves back or the trees get smaller, does the giraffe's neck shrink? Can you reverse these evolutionary processes through behavior? So there's two entirely different questions, but they're both thinking about Kant and thinking about where he's getting his ideas. Because he was hanging out with Rousseau, but apparently not talking. But I imagine he read some Rousseau and the other philosophers.
He read Rousseau. Yeah, I mean, Kant, I think Leibniz is the connection that I've been most interested in. Leibniz, because he uses the Leibnizian word monad for the very, very simplest organisms that are spontaneously generated. And so I think he also loved novels. He loved the novels of Walter Scott. I think it's an eclectic. He was obviously very influenced by Linnaeus and by Buffon, Kant, I don't see a direct connection, although there's a kind of intellectual universe in which these ideas are, in which there's a resemblance of ideas, and I can certainly see that. But the connection I really see is with Leibniz and the idea of these kind of very simple, of course, though unlike Leibniz, to Lamarck, they are material. He was really a materialist, I think. So these are fully material little entities that are spontaneously generated and that give rise to all higher and more organized forms of life. Whether the process can go in reverse, I mean, of course, with the I was mentioning some examples of vestigial, eyes and teeth and the disappearance of legs. So certainly, in that sense, it can go in reverse. And I think there's also a really interesting trajectory over the course of Lamarck's life and career, that he starts off with a much more progressive, sort of simple progressive model of living things becoming more and more complex, kind of more like the old Great Chain of Being pictures, where living things are becoming more and more complex, and they're kind of there's a kind of march of progress. And as he proceeded through his research and his successive writings, it got messier and messier. You see him sort of pulling his hair out, trying to make it fit into and finally, by the last writings, he has sort of arrived at the idea that there are organisms that are different from one another, but neither of them is more perfect or more complex or more advanced than the other. Like this one is more complex and perfect and advanced in certain ways, but this one in other ways. So you really can't rank them. And so he says, at that point, he says, it's a very branchy structure, very, very branchy. It's sort of outward rather than upward. And so I think that's a really interesting moment. And Stephen Jay Gould actually has a very beautiful, very short, but very beautiful essay about this called, I think it's called A Tree Grows in Paris, about that kind of struggle. He really was trying to make it be a progressive story of better and better, more and more perfect, and he ended up with an outward story, a very branchy tree. Yeah.
Well, I'm afraid with branchy trees, we're going to have to call things to a close. But join me one more time in thanking Professor Riskin for this year's